Welcome to this week's episode of the CPG View, the number one CPG information source for global omnichannel leaders. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining this week's episode of the CPG View. I've been a fan of yours for some time, and I've seen you make moves, and you continue to be a leader in our space. So I'm super pumped to have you on. Before we get started, would you mind introducing yourself, your role in the company you're at?
Yeah, for sure. So thank you so much, Don, first for inviting me. You're definitely one of the few accounts, especially on LinkedIn, that my team and I always look at and getting all the insights. So I hope you know just how powerful that is for a lot of us, that when budgets are being cut, we look at your information of what is Boston Consulting Group publishing today.
I'm glad I could help.
And so a little bit about me, I've been at Kraft Heinz now for about a year. I started my career off in a little bit more on the brick and mortar side, so traditional category management, sales in the Canadian zone. And for me, I really wanted to grow my career and get a more holistic perspective to think more end to end. And my last few roles have been focusing in digital in the sales and marketing world. And now within Kraft Heinz, my current role is I do process improvements. I have last mile and delivery for the US zone, and on the digital shelf for the Canadian and the US zone. So it's definitely a big, large team and touch different areas from sales to process to marketing. So some days I'm like, okay, which hat do I wear, or what hat am I wearing in this meeting? Which I love about that, because it challenges me to think differently and think more holistically. And that's what I'm excited about to talk to you today, specifically around the digital shelf. It's definitely an area that continues to evolve, and an area that Kraft Heinz is seen already as best in class. And so everyone looks to us to see what are we doing next. And there's a lot of stuff that's up our sleeves that we really want to continue to transform and be disruptive in the marketplace.
Yeah, I love that. To your point, we did a poll a few weeks ago with regards to investments in tech and capabilities, and the high level replies from that survey were about 2/3 were either reducing or reallocating, and about a third were investing more. So to your point, I think listening to you in this episode will be very helpful for the community. Hopefully, as much as, to your point, I've been able to help serve and support your team with my nerdy sharings on LinkedIn.
I love it. I always wait. I'm like, what do we have this week?
I love it. All right, awesome. Well, digging in here, can you tell us more about some challenges that Kraft Heinz faced when it comes to reaching consumers through the digital shelf, and how you thought about that? I know you've been there a year. I'm sure it probably wasn't perfect, and it's probably still not perfect, but just some maybe high level, broad brush strokes would be helpful.
Yeah. So you're right. It's not perfect, and it will never be perfect because it continues to evolve. And the biggest challenge that we face, and I don't think it's just us, I think it's the industry, is working with the retailers who don't have the technology. And that is our biggest barrier, is how do we work with the retailers and influence them to invest in the right technology, have the right connectivities, the API connectivities, so that we can syndicate our data right away, so that we can drive organic growth and an organic shelf and partner with them and ultimately drive conversion. It's a win-win for both us and the retailer. And that is 100% our number one opportunity and our barrier at the same time when it comes to both the US and the Canadian zone. The retailers who have a max score, say, of 100%, which no one does, but the closest one, say, is between Walmart and Amazon, there's still room for improvement, but you're never going to drive that conversion to that level of those retailers if you don't have the right technology and take the time to invest. During COVID, a lot of the retailers, especially the smaller guys, were just trying to get up and running. So they did a lot of manual processes, but now it's at a point where you have to invest in order to continue to compete with the industry and gain your market share back, because you're going to continue to lose it. And there's not much that we can do either from continue to do the manual uploads if they don't spend the time also investing. So that's something that is top of mind for us, to continue partner with the retailers and giving them the so what and the why, what's this going to do for them, and have a mutual conversation and collaboration to continue to drive the digital shelf forward the way they do in store. It's the same amount of investment and effort the way they do online, because there's still heavy weighing in store no matter what. If If you look at organization structures, if you look at retailer structures, it's still very heavily weighed. But we all know through some of the data that you've published, and a lot of our partners through Profitero and Forbes, is in the next few years, you're looking at 70% of all sales being influenced online. And if you don't have the right content, you're not set up right, you're actually going to start losing those opportunities and that conversion from your own consumers who shop at your store, because it's just going to go somewhere else. But loyalty is not the same as it used to be 10 years ago.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think to your point, COVID really accelerated that for so many. The maybe affinity and loyalty to brands was pressured for no other reason, probably other than availability and scarcity of products. And to your point, I think brands really have hit a crescendo or a point where you have to invest. You have to make sure your digital chef capabilities, you show up in the same way that you would show up in to your point, a Walmart or a Target or whatever retailer. You're really putting your best foot forward. You really need to have that same level of rigor and structure and discipline on the digital shelf, because it's just as important, and probably, to use your words, maybe even more important, because 60 to 70% of sales will be influenced digitally. I mean, that stat alone itself is enough to make you step out and pause.
And think to yourself, like, if I don't have, especially consumers, if they're not, when they're in store, they're looking at their phones most of the time. They'd rather look at their phones and make sure that it's on their shopping list and talk to an associate in store. And if it's the wrong image, if the pricing's not right, if it's the wrong grammage, they can step away. Most likely they will. And it's important to make sure you have that consistency.
Yeah, great point. Well, going to that, I know you and I belong to the same club, the Retail E-commerce Club, and we're actually working on an initiative now to build a framework for RFPs. But I wanted to ask you your point of view here on what has been your process of selecting the right tech partners to help address certain challenges, and maybe any best practices you picked up along the way.
So that's very timely, because we went through a massive RFP that my team led in Q4. And a lot of it was we needed to ensure we find a partner who not only supports our syndication goals, but supports our vision to create truly the best in class digital shelf experience in the industry to serve our consumers. So we have very clear expectations in 3 buckets. One bucket was proactive and transparent account support, syndication excellence, and syndication technology. And ultimately for us was ensuring that they had hit all 3 buckets against our expectations. And then we created a very clear decision criteria of what my team needed, what our internal teams needed, what our retailers needed, and who was going to come out on top. So we did basically a little scorecard, and we went through that to ultimately choose who are our right partners. So we did make a couple of big changes for Kraft Heinz on who our new tech partners are. And Salsify continues to be one of our key partners, and they definitely see Kraft Heinz as best in class. You see my team from Greg and Lexi on some of their websites. They have a lot of quotes. We've done a lot of collaboration with them because they're a fantastic partner. They continue to push the envelope, and that's what we're looking for. And so that's, for us, is not just what can you do for me today, it's how are you preparing us to do what we need to do in the future and continue to evolve to become best in class. When I think about the CPG world, we are very behind considered, other aspects of the industries or the categories from where Nike or Disney is. So how are we bringing that technology, those insights to the CPG food industry and leveraging that information, not just within North America, but globally, to continue to evolve? And that's where a lot of our conversations were when we were doing our RFP.
Yeah, it's interesting. You say a couple of things there that I totally can relate to in terms of the scorecard and consistency across, and really formalizing a process. And, respect to you. I know you're a servant leader and you really focus on shedding light on your team. So, hats off to you as a leader to a leader. I recognize that and want to make sure I give you the acknowledgement. The other thing too, I would say, having worked with Rob and team at Salsify over the years, they really do a great job, kind of top to bottom. And I think they've established a formula and a framework that allows brands to plug in at their various stages of maturity And I think you and I both have been at different organizations or have several different cohorts of friend groups that are in similar roles to ours over the years. And you know, one organization it may be at a crawl stage of their digital maturity.
Yeah.
One might be at a walk stage. One might be at a run stage. But I feel like the team at Salsify, and this is not an ad for Salsify, but
No, it's not, but they know what they're doing,
I
right?
feel like they've got the process and structure down, so a brand can plug in and really kind of meet them where they're at in their journey and make sure they're not giving them too much or not enough. So
yeah. And they ask for help, which I have a lot of respect for. So they come to my team and they ask, like, for Greg and Lexi, like, what can we do differently? How do we support? How can we help? And they get leaders together. So they had a summit a couple of weeks ago with about 30 people of just talking about how to get better, obviously in confidential information. Were not shared, but it was ultimately to service the industry to be continue to push forward and share what's working, what's not working from connectivity standpoint. And I think it's important. And I thank you for acknowledging my team, because they make us look good. So while I'm here, talking to you, it's because my team does such a fantastic job every day and pushing the envelope in our vision and strategy that allows me to be here today with you. So I'm very fortunate that I have a fantastic team and I have a lot of heart and passion for them.
love that. Well, I wanted to ask you, looking ahead at our future here, what are some trends or innovations in the digital marketing and content space that you and your team are keeping an eye on?
It's interesting because for us right now, what we're going through is because we're considered amongst a lot to be, the best in class in the digital shelf area. We're trying to think about how we continue to evolve ourselves to set that standard. Our mission is to drive organic growth and be that organic growth engine in the digital shelf in the industry and within Kraft Heinz, ultimately to service our North American mission of being an indispensable food partner. We are looking to drive transformational change in different areas. We have 5 specific pillars that we're very targeting ourselves against to reset the future of the digital shelf and where we wanted to go from where we are today. We want to be at the forefront of that change. We want to be disruptive. We want to be different. So for us, it's about setting the trends in the digital marketing space and the content space and looking for those right partners to do that. The biggest thing on my mind is truly consumer intimacy. And when I think about that, it is about how do we service the consumer and how do we give them what they want to receive and how they want to receive it versus us dictating what we believe they should be receiving. And I think that's ultimately the shift that CPG has to kind of continue to make. And it's not revolutionary in the mindset because we do it in store. When you shop at Walmart, in Chicago versus in Texas, it's not the same layout. They're not looking at the same consumer. And so how do we start treating our digital space in that same type of mindset?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that exact point you just made, a Walmart in Chicago versus a Walmart in Texas, really contextually relevant imagery and POP is going to be shown, right? I mean, yeah. And I don't know if you've ever lived in Texas, but I have, and a lot of their POP features big Texas like flags in Texas for big brands. I mean, the bigger brands in the space, that would not be what would be shown in Massachusetts or in Chicago. Yeah. And I think to your point, the digital shelf, I feel we're at such an inflection point because I think you and I and a handful of us really see this so clearly because you see a couple things and we don't feel like any of us are that much smarter than anyone else, but we see it. You see 60 to 70% of sales are going to be digitally influenced. Okay. You see that 15% or so of total retail sales are digital in the US currently. And we also see that number, instead of 15% or 20% in the US, is 50 or so percent in China and almost 30% in the UK. So we see all that. And for us, it's not hard to say, hey, here's what we should invest in. Here's why. And so you bring up a couple of good points that I think many of us are almost living a quite similar matrix life of
You're
these
just like,
presentations we're giving. Yeah.
it's just like it's going on in your head. You're like, okay, like I'll repeat it. You repeat
Yeah.
it. You repeat it. You're hopefully, it's like talking to like my daughter who's 2.5, and you have 3 kids.
Yeah.
It's the repetition that you're hoping somebody will pick up on.
Yeah.
And think about. It's like, if we don't prepare for what the future is, we will be underdeveloped. And to your point, with China, the UK, North America is significantly underdeveloped, and there's so much room to grow, but you can't do it the same way. And I just find that when you look at in store, they don't. So they're the category fundamental principles are still there. How do we just apply it to the digital world?
Great point. Well, I wanted to ask you, with the increased demand from operators such as ourselves and our teams representing brands, as there's a demand for quality content for us because we see consumers are demanding that, what are some strategies or maybe tactics that you and your team have implemented to ensure Kraft Heinz is meeting and maybe exceeding those expectations?
Around talking specifically on the digital shelf on content?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So for us, it was really going from foundational product content and just thinking images and just getting them syndicated to really thinking about consistent analysis on site, search dynamics, click-through rates, conversion rates. And it's continuously to involve and drive that transformational mindset. And we know that content does fuel growth, from search rankings to click-through rates and conversion. So we developed a flywheel that allows us and enables us to continue to do a lot of A/B testing, think differently, and implement changes. And that is why I truly believe we continue to evolve, and how we continue to be best in class is that we just don't accept status quo and we change. So if something's working great, but is it still is it still the best? I don't know. Maybe a year ago, but not anymore. So all we do is test, change it up, and see what happens with our ROI analysis, and then scale up.
Yeah, great point. You mentioned a couple things there that I'm just drawing parallels to. We had Dave Wright, who's the CEO and founder of Pattern On, a couple of weeks ago on the CPG View, and he was talking about how important it was to drive the formula for him, and his background is math and data.
Not my background.
Right. Not mine either. I'm sure he has a formal degree and not just math, but Dave, forgive me. But how important for him it was to drive traffic, to convert the traffic, and make sure you had the availability and focus on lifetime value. So for him, it was math driven, and I think to your point, it's really for us about leaders leading the way, empowering our teams, giving the direction to make sure they're making the best choices possible, knowing that it's not going to ever be 100% accurate, and that's okay. And at any point in time, we are 100% accurate. We're probably not thinking big enough. We're probably not pushing the organization boundaries
100%.
enough. So I totally agree with your points. Well, I guess in closing, I know that you were at the Bazaar Voice Summit with Doug and team, and I was wondering if you could share 1 or 2 insights that you took away from that session that you would want to share with the audience.
Oh, so it's funny because you get Doug, Zarina, and I in a room and we can talk for hours on end. What I would say for that summit, some of the biggest takeaways is for everyone to continue to not think about where we are today, but where you want to be in the future, and what the role the digital shelf will play. For me, when I was talking with Doug, we were really focusing on consumer intimacy around the digital shelf. What does that look like? How do we define it? And ensuring that we got our voices heard around, in the industry, how do we evolve that and work with our retailers and involving that for what consumers want and expects. But I think ultimately within that summit as well is talking about how there's the paid and the organic search strategy and how they both relate to one another. And there is a balance of that. And depending on where a company is at, or a product line is at, or brand is at, how do you leverage those two to drive your digital shelf? Because you have some platforms on page 1 that demand 6 out of the 10 slots to be paid, but you have some that are 2 out of 10 slots. And how are you adjusting your strategy against each of these retailers to ultimately drive your digital shelf forward? Knowing that, like to your point earlier, is that dollars are not going to continue to expand. You said 2/3 of the people are removing, some people are expanding, and you have to adjust your digital shelf strategy to reflect that, because there isn't dollars. It's similar to how category management used to do it for in-store. It was paid for space. They're just applying those same principles online. So you have to work within that realm to get your top slots, but there's a lot of stuff you can do with the algorithms, with your organic side to reduce your media spend and reallocate to drive full funnel. And I think that's where Bazaar Voices continue to drive. Yes, they have the ratings and reviews, but they're trying to get that voice out of what is that right balance for the industry, because we will all tap out of cash in order to drive media.
Yeah, great points. Awesome summary from a tremendous leader. I will offer it up. Is there anything else you'd like to leave with the audience as we close? We're on a mission on the CPG View to be the #1 CPG information source for global omni-channel leaders. If you've listened to the CPG View, you probably hear that every time in the beginning. But I really appreciate you joining and really being a steward and an ambassador for that mission. So with that being said, any final closing notes you want to leave with the audience?
I always go back to Kodak. The one thing I would say to leave everybody with is, how do you avoid to be Kodak? Kodak had the insights, they had the inventions, they knew what consumers wanted, but they failed to continue to grow because they didn't have the foresight to allow that to follow through. And then embrace change, which is imperative to continue to grow. So if there's one thing I would say to step away with, is embrace the change, lean into the change, and bring others along for that change in order to move forward, because where we are today doesn't mean it will be there in the future, and it could be gone in an instant. So embrace that change and continue to push.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for joining this week's episode of the CPG View.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the CPG View, the #1 CPG information source for global omni-channel leaders.